you grew up in the 80s or 90s and were a metalhead or a goth or into punk or hardcore or any other music subculture, there's a huge chance that these scenes not only changed your life forever, they likely still significantly influence who you are as a person to this day. I see over and over in the comments people saying how these communities either literally saved them or at minimum gave them something just as valuable. An ethos of authenticity, independence, and integrity that helped them discover who they were and gave them the confidence to live life on their own terms instead of following the herd. So in today's video, I want to talk about the likely reasons we were drawn to these scenes in the first place, how they actually trained us to become such psychologically resilient adults, and the truth about how deeply music can influence our lives, even decades later. Now, if you've been following this channel for a while, you know that even though later in life my musical taste expanded more into hard rock and metal, which is obvious given the theme of this channel, I actually grew up in the hardcore scene, which was probably the very best part of my entire adolescence and young adulthood. I completely credit the scene for teaching me about life and people and understanding the value of thinking for myself and questioning the mainstream. It also gave me a support system of people that I genuinely admired and respected. And of course, it gave me a lifelong love of music and the arts in general. And even though the music and the aesthetics were completely different between subcultures, this is something that we really did all seem to share in common, which actually makes a lot of sense. We were all communities of outsiders, whether society labeled us that way or we chose to be that way intentionally because we simply could not relate to or respect the people that embraced the social norms at the time. And that I found really is sometimes for the best. So let's talk about why this ended up being such a positive for so many of us and why these scenes, or at least what we learned from them, have stayed with us all these years. Well, firstly, and something that I appreciate more now than ever, is that these communities taught us to build an identity around values instead of just popularity. And while times have definitely changed, the mainstream culture at the time really wasn't all that different from today in the respect that there was this enormous pressure to fit in and follow the script we were given, and the kids who did this were definitely rewarded. But many of us who questioned this norm found that music-based subcultures seem to reward entirely different things like conviction, curiosity, and commitment. They rewarded people who cared deeply about something, even if no one else really understood why. Another thing that I find interesting that I think factors into this equation is that even though we're all different, people who are drawn to these scenes do often possess a very specific mix of personality traits. In addition to being less conforming and placing a higher value on authenticity, research also suggests that we tend to score considerably higher in openness to experience, meaning that we are intensely curious, imaginative, creative, and drawn to unconventional ideas. We also tend to have a greater tolerance for complexity, which is probably why we enjoy music that explores darker and more ambiguous themes. A lot of us are also very emotionally expressive and comfortable engaging with difficult feelings rather than avoiding them. And not surprisingly, it was also found that these scenes tend to attract people higher in sensation seeking, who actually have a need for intensity, challenge, and novel experiences. Yet another common thread was a propensity for self-expression, usually through things like music, art, writing, or even DIY projects. Many of us also display higher psychological reactance, meaning we're more likely to question authority and resist being told what to think. And finally, it was also found that we're usually more driven by intrinsic motivation, which is when we do something because it aligns with our interests, values, and sense of purpose, rather than the hope of some kind of external reward. So given all of this, it's clear that the music itself was a perfect mirror for these personality traits and values. But I also think that finding an actual community that rejected mainstream conformity in the same way just made us feel a lot less alone. And before I get attacked in the comments, I am fully aware that we were in a way conforming ourselves, especially in how we presented ourselves. We definitely had our own dress codes, and there was absolutely no mistaking one subculture for another. But I really do think this is a lot less hypocritical than it might seem on the surface. There is a huge psychological difference between trying to customize yourself to fit in and simply expressing who you really are through a shared love of music. We dressed the way we did because we actually liked it, and we were proud to represent the groups we were attached to. And even though we looked a lot alike, one of the best things about these scenes was that no one expected you to suppress your individuality in order to belong. In fact, your individuality was often exactly what earned you respect. I think this goes back to something called Optimal Distinctiveness Theory, which is basically just the idea that we all have two competing psychological needs, the need to belong and the need to feel unique. Like we talked about, most social groups satisfy one at the expense of the other. But I think these subcultures offered this brilliant psychological loophole where belonging was actually built around authenticity. So it genuinely satisfied both needs at the same time, which gave us an incredibly strong foundation for developing a confident and enduring sense of self. But still, the big question here remains, why did all of this stay with us decades later? I honestly think it just gave us a really solid blueprint for life. These scenes gave us a psychological toolkit that ended up turning us into resilient, independent, critically thinking adults, which is something that never really changes, even when life does. And I truly believe that the actual music played an equally important role in all of this. I think one of the most unfortunate misconceptions about these genres is the idea that they encourage negativity simply because they openly explore difficult subjects. If anything, I think they accomplish the exact opposite, because they don't pretend that things like fear, anger, injustice, loneliness, or mortality doesn't exist. They allow us to confront things that most people push away. Psychologically, that's a very different process from becoming consumed by negative emotions, which ends up happening to so many people who try to pretend that they aren't there. I think that's one of the reasons why so many of us are completely comfortable having deep, honest conversations about difficult topics. In fact, I think growing up that way makes it almost painful for us to be fake now. Our music taught us that, and the other people in the scene taught us that. What's amazing, though, is that looking back, I don't think that these communities taught us what to think. I think they just taught us how to think. I also think they taught us how to do things for ourselves because nothing was ever handed to us. Instead of waiting for someone else to create the world we wanted to live in, we just did it on our own. And this is something that I think we all still share in common. But I think the biggest thing that people don't understand about these scenes is that they truly were value systems. They really did shape our moral compass. Whether it was punk encouraging us to question authority, hardcore emphasizing integrity and personal responsibility, goth inviting us to think deeply about the human condition, or metal celebrating perseverance and personal mastery, these were not just aesthetic choices. They were life lessons that stayed with us. And maybe that's why so many of us still feel so connected with these communities decades later. It's easy to assume we're all just nostalgic, but I really do think it's something much deeper than that. And honestly, the people who were in these scenes are definitely still the coolest, most intelligent, genuine people I know. I would love to hear about your scene and anything else you'd like to add to this analysis, so I look forward to continuing this conversation in the comments. I want to thank you guys so much for being here. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next video.